McGrowl, Book 2, Chapter 4. Something Strange. "Someone has stolen the class treasury," Miss Thompson announced ruefully. You could have heard a pin drop. She continued, "That someone had better come forward immediately and put the money back in my desk where they found it. Let us put our heads down on our desks and hum loudly." Everyone, including Miss Thompson, put their heads down and started humming. This was the signal for the thief to return the stolen property, then hurry back to his or her desk. At last Miss Thompson looked up and called for the class to stop humming. She felt in the drawer and was clearly disappointed and somewhat surprised. The missing $34.25 was nowhere to be seen. Thomas and Violet exchanged quizzical glances. What was going on? Thomas had heard the news last night about a robbery over at the hardware store. Violet reminded him that her cousin's tricycle had been stolen only yesterday. Was this part of a larger pattern? In all of his years at Stevenson, no one had ever stolen so much as a piece of chalk. Louis Musser took a lot of things, but not without asking first. You never dared say no when Louis asked, but that wasn't the same as stealing. Thomas wondered for a moment if perhaps the evil duo had returned and was up to one of their devilish schemes. The thought quickly vanished when he saw the unmistakable tip of a yellow tail wagging happily outside the window. Thomas quietly sidled over to the back of the room. "What are you doing here?" he asked softly. McGrowl pretended he was hard of hearing and burrowed deeper into the bushes. "Go home! Go home, please! Whatever you do, go home!" "I beg your pardon, young man." Miss Thompson didn't seem amused. "Why should I go home?" The class started to laugh hysterically. Miss Thompson took up the large ruler she kept by the side of her desk and smashed it loudly against the blackboard, her swift and efficient way of demanding silence. She got it. Her gleaming eyes seemed to bore a hole in the boy while she waited for a reply. "I repeat," she intoned dryly, "why should I go home?" Again there was silence. "Cat got your tongue?" McGrowl heard the word cat and tensed up even more. Thomas was so terrified, all he could muster up was a barely audible, what?" came the angry reply. Miss Thompson?" Evidently that was the response she was looking for. "You will clean the erasers for the next 3 days. During recess you will arrange the chairs for chorus. After lunch on Tuesday—" As she droned on with her list of annoying punishments, Thomas's attention drifted over the sound of the distant trumpets, and then the sound of drums beating rhythmically, and the tinkling of a dozen glockenspiels. Something very much like a parade seemed to be making its way toward the school. Everyone leapt out of their chairs and rushed to the windows to get a better look. Miss Thompson picked up her ruler again and rapped it furiously against her desk, so many times that it broke in half. "Order in the class! Order in the class!" she hollered as she waved pieces of the broken ruler wildly about in each hand. No one paid the slightest attention to her. The brass section started playing "Hail to the Chief," while a corps of majorettes in red and gold uniforms tossed flyers bearing the picture of a heavy-set, smiling fellow into the gathering crowd. By now the procession was only a couple of 100 feet away from Stevenson. McGrowl forgot he was supposed to be hiding. He rushed over to the throng and ran around, barking and wagging his tail furiously. He loved a good parade as much as any red-blooded American dog. By now the entire middle school had come out to see what was happening. Even Miss Thompson picked out of the window discreetly to watch proceedings. Thomas and Violet edged forward to get a better look. A smiling man riding on a beautifully decorated float stepped forward. He looked exactly like the man on the flyers, only he was a little shorter and a little heavier. The car pulling the float came to a halt so suddenly he almost fell over, and everyone gasped. He teetered precariously for a moment and finally caught his balance. At last he spoke. A hush fell quickly over the milling throng. The man yelled into a bullhorn, I'm Mel Muchnick. I'm running for mayor of this glorious town, and I'm so happy I could scream." His booming voice reverberated loudly throughout the area. McGrowl covered his ears with his paws. The man was screaming, and pretty soon the crowd was screaming too. Thomas's father was right. A rousing parade certainly was proving to be a brilliant way to kick off a mayoral campaign. Every time the man spoke, he was cheered and applauded. He promised lower taxes and higher buildings. He was for grandmothers and babies, against crime and pollution. The crowd was in an absolute frenzy. Thomas and Violet helped pass out scarves and hats. "Vote for Mel Muchnick is a happy vote," was emblazoned on each and every one of them. McGrowl took his paws down from his ears and listened closely. He couldn't understand everything the man was saying, but his loud and friendly voice certainly was reassuring. The dog didn't put up the slightest fuss when someone leaned over and put a hat and scarf on him. And then Mel Muchnick raised his hands for silence. Even the birds stopped chirping. He made a long, dramatic pause. For a second, Thomas thought he'd forgotten his lines. At last he spoke, quietly but with great feeling. "I love this country. I love this town. I love this neighborhood. And I love each and every one of you." The crowd went absolutely mad. Muchnick shook hands and kissed babies and smiled joyously. Photographers aimed their cameras and snapped away. And then Thomas noticed his father anxiously observing the proceedings from the rear of the car that was pulling the float. He had written the candidate's speech himself, with only a teeny bit of help from Mrs. Wiggins. Every last detail of the parade, however, was his, down to the tassels on the majorette's high white boots, and he was very proud. Thomas rushed over to McGrowl to warn him to hide. Before he could get there, someone scooped up the dog and placed him on the platform next to the candidate. Short of a miracle, there was absolutely no chance that his father wouldn't notice. "This is it," Thomas said to himself. "This is really it." McGrowl, still wearing his hat and scarf, posed adorably for the photographers as if he knew exactly what was going on, which of course he did. He loved the attention. He held perfectly still while Muchnick patted him on the head. He even held up his paw to shake hands with the mayor-to-be, while 1,000 flashbulbs snapped and crackled. Thomas couldn't help but notice the look that came over his father's face when he spotted the furry source of the photographer's attention. "Come on down, Henry Wiggins," Muchnick bellowed. The rest of the blood drained quickly from Mr. Wiggins' already pale face. McGrowl was off the leash, so a terrified Mr. Wiggins waved from the safety of the rear of the car and mouthed several nervous "no's." Muchnick, however, realizing this was a perfect opportunity for a group shot, wasn't about to take "no" for an answer. And then, much to Mr. Wiggins' chagrin, Mel Muchnick started a rousing chorus of "We want Wiggins!" And 300 cheering onlookers eagerly joined in the chant. "Wiggins! Wiggins!" they screamed as they threw their hats in the air and waved their arms wildly. Mr. Wiggins protested violently as a couple of eager campaign workers pried him loose from the back of the car and started pushing him forward onto the platform. Thomas and Violet held their breath as they watched poor Mr. Wiggins being manoeuvred closer and closer to the object of his greatest terror. "What if he faints in front of all these people?" Violet asked. "Think Muchnick'll have him fired?" "In a heartbeat," Thomas replied without even thinking. But wonder of wonders, Mr. Wiggins didn't faint. He summoned every ounce of courage he could and remained upright. Shaky, but upright. The crowd grew still as photographers drew in closer for the all-important group photo. McGrowl looked discreetly away from Mr. Wiggins, not even daring to catch his eye, as the candidate stationed himself right between the two of them, much to Mr. Wiggins' relief. "Shake hands," Muchnick whispered urgently under his breath. Mr. Wiggins held out a hand and attempted to shake Muchnick's. "No, you idiot! Shake the dog's hand." "Oh," Mr. Wiggins glumly replied. "You want me to shake the dog's hand?" But he didn't make a move. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Muchnick was clearly getting annoyed. Again the crowd chanted, "Shake his hand! Shake his hand!" McGrowl held out a paw and attempted to smile sweetly at Mr. Wiggins, which was something of a mistake. Instead of appearing to smile, the dog's rather large and unwieldy lips took on an ominous appearance of a snarl. "Could you please restrain the animal?" was all Mr. Wiggins could manage to say. "Don't be ridiculous," Muchnick replied. "Let's get on with it." So Mr. Wiggins held his breath, leaned down, put out his quivering hand. It was the closest he had ever been to a dog, and certainly the first time he had voluntarily attempted to touch one. McGrowl did his best to hold absolutely rock-solid still. He wished he had remembered to ask Thomas to clip his nails. They were somewhat longer than he felt Mr. Wiggins would like. 300 people cheered as a host of photographers busily snapped away. Mr. Wiggins looked toward heaven and said a quiet prayer, made contact with the dog, and lived to tell the tale. Thomas could hardly believe his eyes. He tugged excitedly at Violet's sweater. I see, she replied softly. "Who would have thunk it?" And then, not to be outdone by his campaign manager, Mr. Muchnick got down on his hands and knees and crawled over and kissed the dog smack on the lips. McGrowl wasn't used to anyone taking such liberties with him, let alone strangers who were running for mayor. He quickly pulled back and wiped his mouth discreetly with his paw. He noticed how bristly the man's moustache was. He noticed that the man appeared to be wearing a great deal of makeup. And then he noticed a strange but familiar odour. It was difficult to detect at first because the man had gone to some length to cover it up with a heavy dose of a musky, bitter cologne. McGrowl recognized the smell but couldn't put his paw on it precisely where he had noticed it before. After another sustained round of cheers and testimonials, Mr. Wiggins located Thomas and begrudgingly gave McGrowl one last chance. He would be allowed to compete in the dog show trials after all. But, Mr. Wiggins firmly reminded Thomas, any more bad behaviour and we're talking obedient school. We're talking no dessert ever. We're talking dry dog food and water. And then Muchnick and his noisy caravan headed off to the mall on the far side of town for another rally. The crowd of happy students and teachers waved goodbye at last, put aside their new hats and scarves and headed back to their classrooms. They were in for a big surprise.